Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I am Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we are pleased to have Katherine Trebeck, who will discuss why it matters how the government measures progress. Before starting, I want to take this opportunity just to remind people about the upcoming ISQual's conference deadline. If you're an accepted author and have not yet registered, please do so before the 30th of April. Back to today. Katherine will speak for around 30 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And as a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Katherine Trebeck. Katherine is a political economist, writer, and advocate for economic system change. Her roles include writer-at-large and co-director of the Compassion in Financial Services Hub at the University of Edinburgh, economic change lead for the Next Economy, and strategic advisor for the Centre for Policy Development in Australia. She co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and also We All Scotland, or that's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland, its Scottish hub. And she integrated the group of Wellbeing Economy Governments, instigated the group of Wellbeing Economy Governments. She is a member of the Club of Rome, and her board roles have included a range of groups such as Hands Across Canberra, Denmark's Wellbeing Economy Lab, the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, and the Democracy Collaborative. She was 2024 Thinker in Residence at the Australian Health Promotion Association, was 2023 Thinker in Residence at Australia's National University's Planetary Health Hot House, and is a New Economics Senior Fellow at the Zoe Institute. I met Katherine at the OECD Wellbeing Forum last year and was very much impressed by what she had to say, and am very much looking forward to today's presentation. Without further ado, Katherine, the floor is yours.
Thanks ever so much, Kelsey, and good morning, everyone. If it's morning where you are, or good evening if you're someone like me, where it's coming into Thursday night. Okay, bear with me as I now try to share my screen. This is the moment of truth. And Kelsey, can you give me, I can't see anyone now. So I'm just going to be, that's all good to go? Okay, all right. I want to start, as has become quite important here in Australia, to acknowledge the country I'm coming to you from. And this is a picture from the hill just behind my house. So in the middle of the capital city of Canberra, you can feel like you're completely in the bush in this beautiful, beautiful landscape. And the traditional owners of this part of the world are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional Aboriginal custodians. And I want to respect that because it is an important aspect of Australia's economy that our economic system here is on unceded and essentially stolen land. And I want to also apologise to you. I'm definitely not a statistician, as will be very, very apparent. I have one chart that I will share with you. The rest will be more a bringing together of various different concepts and so on that I've sort of got where my head is around the way that this agenda and the ideas of well-being are coming into government spaces through my various work with different governments here in Australia and particularly in Scotland in recent years. I also apologise because I'm Australian and I say data, not data. So my apologies for that. I know that will probably bug the hell out of many of you, but that's the horrible Australian accent. And my final apology, in a way, is the title of this presentation, Why the Way Government Measures Progress Matters, because I suspect by definition, many of you are joining just that is obvious. That is the essence of your job. You're here to improve measures of progress and integrate that into government. And what I want to share with you, and I was saying to Kelsey before we started, it would be great to hear your experiences and what resonates, or if things have gone in a different direction from you. I'd really love to hear about that and learn from that. What I'm going to share really is some big picture patterns that have emerged from analysis that I've done over various years. So what I'm going to cover is, of course, measures matter, but which ones really get traction. I'm going to share with you very briefly a little bit about the Wellbeing Economy agenda. I know that you've had my dear colleague and friend Amanda Janu speak to you I think about a year ago, where she dived deep into the wellbeing economy agenda. So if you need a bit more on that, her video is one to go for. And then think about how the wellbeing economy agenda interacts with various government processes. But I also want to share with you a couple of illustrations of how different governments are grappling with some of the challenges of integrating different measures of progress into government processes. So hopefully that makes a worthwhile hour from you. But as I said, love to make sure we have time for discussion at the end where we can kick around ideas and hear about your experience. So, I mean, just the most basic, the lenses that we view the world really matter. They can mean that we turn a blind eye to really important issues, or that we put disproportionate focus on something else. The lenses that we adopt also can have inherently perverse incentives with them, and we can talk about gross domestic product, or they can average out imbalances in society. And so how we choose to look at the world and how we choose to assess it and measure, essentially the lenses that we adopt, is really critical for how we transmit and absorb process, and then the analysis and assessment, let alone the responses. So literally the measures that we adopt and integrate are crucial for how government operates. And yet this is a bit of a fun way of just showing what I suspect, which something many of you will recognize, that so often some of the measures that governments utilize and prioritize and adhere to or defer to most in their everyday work is profoundly misaligned to what people need. And we see that in the differences, for example, between US productivity measures, which have sort of been moving up and up and up over recent decades, and yet real wages in the US have flatlined. We see that in the difference over many years and in many countries between gross domestic product in recent decades and measures such as the genuine progress indicator, the huge disconnect between the two. Also, you could look at countries like Australia, the difference between share prices, which have been rising over many decades, and yet we're seeing so much of our environment being pushed beyond breaking point. And hence why we need to pay attention to some of these other dynamics, perhaps, and bring them to the fore in a different way. While, of course, there is a lot of data about this, what we're seeing still is some of these challenges facing the world is still getting worse. So we've got a world that's profoundly unequal. These two contrasting images, I think, illustrate this very starkly. On the left-hand side, you have what at the time was the most expensive cocktail in the world. I'm a bit ashamed to say it was from a bar in Melbourne. It's called the Winston, after Winston Churchill. And at the time, it would set you back over 12,000 Australian dollars, about 66,000 euros or so. And on the right-hand side, I think a beautiful and painfully so illustration of the sacrifices that many families are making to take care of their children in the face of a cost of living crisis. And I'll just say, the more you look at that cartoon on the right, the more you'll see little details, that the holes in the socks, the mold on the wall, the microwave food, and you'll know the subsequent impact on the health and education chances of a child growing up in a sort of household that this cartoon depicts. And of course, at the same time, we're seeing the world experience incredible warming and profound loss of biodiversity. And we have the measures to illustrate that. And yet we are not seeing sufficient action on this front. This is the one chart that I'm going to show you, and I think it's one of the most important measures that we can imagine, because of course, while we're seeing huge pressure being put on the planet because of human activity, it is not all humans. There's huge inequality in who it is who's putting most pressure on the planet. And I spent almost 10 years working with Oxfam, so I'm very proud that my former colleagues in Oxfam have been doing this analysis. Of course, it's been replicated by scholars such as Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty. But essentially, and the irony that this measure reveals a champagne glass, rather similar to the previous image, what they've done here is they've looked at income deciles from around the world and mapped it by consumption-based CO2 emissions. And it reveals by this painfully ironic champagne glass that the richest 10% are responsible for over half of the world's CO2 emissions because of their consumption patterns. So I think this is one of the most critical measures we could take. And this is an image I drove past a few weeks ago in the town where I live, and it struck me as almost summarizing, in a way, the real tension and hamster wheel that so many governments are facing. So Club Lime is a gym in Australia. It's a chain of gyms and health centres and so on. And it is co-located in a company, I don't know if Hungry Jack's is in Europe, but it's a company like McDonald's. It's a fast food company that doesn't sell particularly healthy food. And yet they're co-located. I suspect maybe they're even co-owned by the same company. And it just, the irony of having these two together almost sums up the efforts on the one hand of government to deliver better lives for people being undermined by activities on the other hand, as epitomized here by going to the gym while at the same time eating takeaway hamburgers. And it shows that all these great efforts to bring about wider measures of progress into government analysis are not going to have a chance if we do not turn our attention to the way the economic system operates, because it can undermine and undo and is a countervailing force to the potential success of so many of those other measures. Hence why I talk about the wellbeing economy and put the adjective on wellbeing in front of the economy. We have to really look at and train our attention on how the economy operates. And so at its most basic, the idea of the wellbeing economy is an economy very, very deliberately designed to meet the needs of people and planet. And what do I mean by that when I say meet the needs of people and planet? Just to give you an illustration of that, this was a story that was in the UK Guardian several years ago now, and about an initiative in Wales that was supporting people who were sleeping on the streets in Wales by giving them stab-proof coats that could be turned into sleeping bags. Now, I think that's a great story. It's probably, the initiative was probably set up by very, very well-intentioned people, and no disrespect to them. I imagine it won some sort of social innovation prize, but it also breaks my heart, because what is it that people who are sleeping rough really need? They need shelter and safety and warmth. You know, going back to that idea of fundamental human needs by one of my intellectual heroes, Max Neef. And so often policy is directed downstream at sort of responding to putting band-aids, as you see here, over some of the gaping wounds caused by an unequal and unsustainable economic system. I also want to talk about the material basis of well-being. Of course, there's a lot of material and a lot of evidence around the various drivers of well-being, relationships, sense of purpose, time in nature, and so on, time with friends. And this is an image that was on the table of contents of a happiness magazine that was in my local newsagent when I lived in Glasgow a few years ago. And essentially it says the route to wellness, as they describe it, the route to well-being was to have your friends around for a drink, go out for a run, do some meditation, take your dog for a walk, and go on a yoga retreat to Thailand. And admittedly, that's all very good and lovely. But if you are someone who is working on poverty wages and really struggling with the cost of living crisis, like you saw in the cartoon I just showed you, the idea of being able to have your friends around for a drink will be beyond your financial reach. If you don't feel safe in the neighborhood where you live, the idea of going out for a jog in the evening or in the morning will be something that you won't be able to entertain. If you are, like many houses in the northern state of Queensland here in Australia, have just been evacuated because of huge floods caused by global warming, or you're being evacuated because of huge wildfires, as we had here in Australia a couple of years ago, you're not going to be able to do some meditation, though admittedly it's probably the what you really need. And if you are someone whose wages have flatlined over the last few years and are not able to save anything and are going into debt because of that disconnect between productivity and wages, you're not going to be able to afford to go on a yoga retreat to Thailand. And I say this essentially to just really reinforce the extent to which the way the economy operates and who it is working for is critical to this conversation. People will not be able to enhance their personal well-being, let alone collective well-being, if the economy is not on their side, if it is not aligned to meet the needs of people and planet. And I wanted to share this quote from our colleagues at the OECD that came out in a report just late last year, talking about the sorts of changes that are needed to bring about good lives and long-term sustainability, essentially the sort of outcomes that a wellbeing economy speaks about. And they talk about, and you can see here this in the italic words, you know, the fundamental changes in how governments allocate resources and design policies, really focus on enabling people to flourish across their lives using new analytical tools. And I think this really speaks to a lot of the work that you do to evaluate policy options according to a multidimensional perspective of well-being, and particularly bringing in those participatory processes to reflect citizens' beliefs about what matters for a good life. And I think it's really great too at the end that the OECD is also pointing the finger at how businesses arrange their business models. And that's a conversation we can get into the Q&A. I won't cover it too much, but about the role of different enterprises in being part of meeting the needs of people and planet. So there's a lot of changes that are needed to build a wellbeing economy, from the local to the international, from how we design our food systems, as you saw from the OECD, the nature of business models, energy systems, design of cities, neighborhoods, transport systems, housing infrastructure, production and consumption systems, tax systems, and so on and so on. So it's a little bit like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, the way you see here in this image. But what do most people do when they're doing a jigsaw puzzle is they start with the corners. And so I want to offer, just as a very loose mechanism or a visualization aid, is that you can think about the 4 corners of the wellbeing economy jigsaw puzzle in practice. So really the practical delivery of a wellbeing economy. You can get your head around it by loosely clustering the changes that are needed into what I call the 4 Ps of the wellbeing economy in practice. And these are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And I suspect Amanda probably talked about these when she did her webinar with you a year or so ago. But essentially, purpose is about really aligning our economic systems with delivering what people and planet need. It's thinking about the economy and growth of the economy as a means rather than an end, which means we are have to be very fussy about what is being grown and what we need to power down. We have to take a qualitative lens to that. What economic activities are good for people and planet? And so let's have more of those, and what are harmful to people and planet, and power that down. And then the micro equivalent of that is, you know, thinking about different businesses. Do they contribute positively, or do they undermine people's well-being? And of course, what you see here in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle are the multidimensional wellbeing frameworks that many, many governments are creating. In fact, over 70% of OECD governments have these multidimensional dashboards and so on. In the prevention corner, this is about activities that are not just about downstream, reactive spending after the fact on repair, healing, amelioration, fixing after the damage has been done. And yet, if you look at a lot of government budgets, you see that so often that's where a lot of government spending goes. It's described as either avoidable costs because of failure demand, essentially demand on various layers of government, because of inequality, poverty, and environmental breakdown. And just to give you a couple of examples, one of my very good friends lives in Melbourne and she works for Melbourne City Council, and her job is as a heat officer. So essentially she has been employed when extreme heat hits Melbourne to help take care of vulnerable people. Now, what's that a sign, a reflection of? One, more and more extreme heat hitting Australia because of our inability to live within planetary boundaries, but also the prevalence of people who don't have sufficient financial income to enable them to take care of themselves in times of extreme heat. I was saying to Kelsey, I just live near a hospital. You might hear a helicopter later on tonight, I'm afraid. A huge amount of accident and emergency spending has links and a huge amount of spending on health, mental health problems, on obesity, all has links in a socioeconomic gradient because of poverty and inequality. A lot of the criminal justice system, a lot of our efforts, they had held a beach cleanup effort and a river cleanup here in Australia recently too. That's because our economies are not sufficiently circular in the way we treat resources. So prevention is about saying we have to do better than that and look upstream and understand the root causes of so many of the challenges facing people and planet and take action there. Now that's very hard, and we could talk about that later in the Q&A. The next one around pre-distribution is essentially recognizing that, yes, of course, governments have a role in reducing the gap between rich and poor through taxes and transfers. But in countries like mine, the government reduces through taxes and transfers economic inequality by about a third. And so pre-distribution is about saying, well, let's get the market economy to do much more of the heavy lifting. So things like community wealth building, workers owning their firms, true cost accounting and so on to better align prices with their environmental or their social cost. And then people powered is one, it matters, of course, for its own sake to sort of democratize the economy. But also we know that when people feel done to, they will quite understandably resist. And we've got many examples of that. So this is making sure that people feel part of the economic change journey through really robust and authentic just transition processes. And one of the organisations I work with is at the forefront of that. So happy to talk about that later, but also through things like citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting. So let's look at government and the role of government in building a wellbeing economy. This looks like a very simple image, but I think it's profoundly important to get our heads around the hierarchy or the sequence of these goals. So at the top right-hand corner, the ultimate goal is meeting the needs of people and planet. So the wellbeing economy is the penultimate goal. How can the economic system really be in service of that? And then we've come to think about, okay, what sort of government do we need that uses policy instruments to enable that sort of economy to come about? And that means we need to take a look at the goals and processes of government. So here on this slide, start down the bottom left-hand corner. So the first, I think, critical question is thinking about, well, what sort of country or what sort of community do we want to be? And the more participatory and inclusive that conversation, the better. And then it comes to measuring what matters. Okay, how do we assess how different groups are faring against that goal, against that vision? How are we going on, various aspects of quality of life that have been identified in a consultation? And then one of the key things is that analysis to understand what are some of those root causes of why different groups are falling behind, why our rivers are unhealthy, for example, why is there plastic in our brains now, and do that upstream analysis. And then figure out different ways of working and policy design in government to take action on those root causes. And then you get the wellbeing budgets, and there's been a lot of attention, particularly because of New Zealand's efforts in this space, a lot of heat and light around wellbeing budgets, where you utilise various fiscal incentives to drive different behaviour and to invest in the sort of activities you need more of. My sense, though, is that wellbeing, the idea of the budgets, and particularly here in Australia, gets way too much attention. It's almost just like where you get the checkout when you're paying for what you've put in your grocery basket. What matters is the suite of policies that you're essentially funding through the budget. So I think we need to pay much more attention in your media, and here in Australia at least, on the way we talk about the policy program. That's really, really critical. I want to share with you some lessons that emerged from an analysis I did a couple of years ago. I was commissioned by a couple of organisations in Scotland to look at how to do government policy design for, in this instance, children's wellbeing. But of course, as many of you will recognise, children's wellbeing doesn't happen in a vacuum. So it's essentially looking at how families and communities around them can flourish. And there's a whole lot of lessons around what is good practice and some of the critical enabling factors to deliver wellbeing. I'm going to rattle through them, but there's a report that I can share with you that lists them in a bit more detail, and very happy to talk about them in the discussion or in a follow-up conversation. So forgive the brevity that I'm about to rattle through now, but very much this is just an opening salvo. But really critical is that high-level vision, that what sort of country, for example, do we want to be? also really critical is putting on the table environmental considerations, because there's no point focusing on sort of perhaps social or economic, in the narrow sense of the economy, considerations if we're plundering the planet. And so holding that to the fore, contextualizing these goals, for example, within a carbon budget or within the realm of planetary boundaries, is really critical. Public involvement is really key, and we see this in contrast between a country like Wales that started its efforts with a big public consultation, compared to New Zealand's efforts, which were relatively top down, wasn't on the back of a public consultation. And it's Wales now that has just celebrated its 10-year anniversary of its work. Happy to share more about my thoughts on those two instances, but public involvement that gives you not just the sense of what's important, but the mandate and legitimacy and hopefully cross-party support for these initiatives. But regularly reporting is really key. Of course, gross domestic product is reported every quarter. Some of these measures don't move as much, but you're really bringing these measures to the fore so that people do pay as much attention to them. The media pays as much attention to them as quarterly GDP. And then aligning spendings with the actions and utilising theories of change. So it's not just looking at downstream responses, but doing that upstream root cause analysis. Having ministers in government responsible and accountable, and whether that's through key ministries having the title of being responsible for this or through parliamentary committees and so on, but having those mechanisms so that it is someone's job is really key here. Also enabling Parliament to have oversight, to criticise, to ask questions, to hold decision makers' feet to the fire is really key here. Enshrining things in legislation is utterly critical too, makes it much harder to overrule. One thing New Zealand did do really well is they did things like changing their State Sector Act to bring about more regular reporting and timely reporting on, say, where New Zealand was going against a suite of wellbeing measures. They also, interestingly, changed their State Sector Act to enable cross-departmental working as well, which I think is really, really interesting. But having legislation that mandates some of this work and integration is really critical. Championship is utterly critical too, and whether you have someone, an independent official body like the Office of the Future Generations in Wales, for example, or some other mechanism. It's risky if it's a politician. My experience in Scotland was that we had the then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, as a huge champion for this agenda. Her TED talk is really worth watching if you haven't watched it. And it was fantastic. The time after her TED talk, it really mobilised a conversation. A lot of civil servants in Scotland said, we can push further because the First Minister has given us this, and it's a horrible term that they use here in Australia, but she has given us the authorising environment to enact changes that are needed on the basis of wellbeing measures. But of course, it's a blessing and a curse having a political champion, because they're a lightning rod for political critique by opposition parties, and also they leave. So she's now leaving Parliament, and with her, a lot of the momentum, sadly. So yeah, blessing and a curse, and having, I think, something like the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales is really critical. But officials in governments need support, tools, training, guidelines, because often integrating wellbeing measures into policy is not a simple flick of the switch. It often goes against perhaps a lot of their economics training that may have trained them to think quite narrowly. But if these are co-created, and the OECD is very clear about this, the best guidelines and tools are ones that are developed in conjunction with officials. And I mentioned earlier, New Zealand, cross-departmental is utterly critical. I mean, folks on this call will recognise that the work being done at the hospital down the road from me is not necessarily just, improvements in people's health is not necessarily just a preserve of doctors and nurses in a hospital. It's also the result of people in education departments, people in the environment department, the transport department, the employment and treasury departments as well. So bringing together that holistic whole of government approach is really key, and aligning their incentives accordingly, really, really critical. So you don't have action on one side undermining action on the other. And then finally, just recognizing this is not easy. It will take time, and we need to be patient around that. I'm going to rattle ahead now because I'm conscious of time. I want to leave as much time for discussion, but I want to share with you a new development in Australia. This is the federal government's Measuring What Matters framework. It was released a couple of years ago. They got a bit of stick, quite, I think, fairly, because many of their measures were out of date. They have since invested a huge amount of money into the Australian Bureau of Statistics, your counterparts, so that they can increase the general household survey, its regularity and the breadth of what it covers, so to increase the quality of the data here in Australia, because there were significant gaps due to governments cutting the funding. That's a whole other story, but it's actually been really important to spotlight some areas where government wasn't collecting timely enough data, potentially, for example, on financial insecurity, and now that's prompted action to address that problem. Remember this arrow I showed you earlier? I want to just give you a sense of where Australia's efforts on measuring matters are up to against this arc. So this is where they've got action now. They are working hard to improve their multidimensional wellbeing dashboard, and as I said, investing in the Australian Bureau of Statistics to improve the data. They skipped this step. They didn't have a big national conversation. They did have a small consultation document on the Treasury's website in January. If any of you have been to Australia, you'll know that in January, most Australians are at the beach. And so the only person who responds to consultations on Treasury websites in January are policy geeks like me. It was far from the sort of robust, inclusive national conversation you'd want. They are not really doing that upstream analysis yet of root causes. They're still just rushing from crisis to crisis, playing whack-a-mole as if these crises are disconnected. They are starting to explore guidelines and suggestions for policy bids to the budget process, very, very tentatively. But they're certainly not doing a wellbeing budget, although a lot of people say, yes, the Treasurer's wellbeing budget. That's entirely not what it is. So I want to talk to you about what others are doing that we can learn from. And of course, the Wellbeing Economy Governments that was launched at the OECD Forum in 2018 is a good example of governments coming together to learn from each other about their respective efforts. It's currently 5 governments: Scotland, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, and Wales, with Canada as an active participant. So it's all about learning labs. I know this is being recorded, but just between you and I, it's kind of like a self-help group for government officials, senior government officials who are wanting to put wellbeing into economic policy making. But I also want to share with you an example from the state of Victoria here in Australia. This is the reality that the government faced a couple of years ago, that their spending on downstream acute services was going up and up and up, and massively outstripping, as you can see here on this chart. And I forgot, I've given you more charts than just the one at the beginning, but you can see that spending on downstream services, failure demand, essentially outstripping their revenue. And so they thought, we have to do something urgent about this. And so they want to do is reduce that need for those downstream services. And so they've introduced a project in the Treasury called the Early Intervention Investment Framework, the EIF for short. And they support social intervention with groups that they are worried are going to present at those downstream services through various projects, such as supporting school completion, breaking the cycle of homelessness, things like community legal and so on. And what they do is they assess the avoidable cost on those downstream services that the government would have had to spend on, and then they bank it and reinvest it and just go on this journey of continuous improvement to try to bring down that level of spending on acute services. The problem with this is that it doesn't go as far upstream to the economy. And this is what the director of that program said to me. And Kelsey, you probably met Matt when we met together in Rome last year. He says, yes, the economy is why people are where they are when we meet them. So taking that almost rallying call, I want to take you to South Australia. And this is their economic statement. You can't see it in these images, but those fuzzy little words at the bottom of that document on the front cover of the economic statement says, we want an economy that is fit for the future and serving the well-beings of all South Australians. And I think that's telling, because it's seeing the economy not a goal in its own right, but as a mechanism to support well-being and sustainability. And then on other pages, it says, we know we've succeeded when our industries are sustainable and powered by renewable energy, when more South Australians are in meaningful and skilled work and paid fairly for their contribution, when all South Australians get the benefit of our strong economy, we'll know we've got it right. And then they continue in saying, we know we've succeeded when we care as much about the state our children and their children will inherit as about the headline statistics of today. And I think that's extraordinary to have those sorts of words on a government economic statement. The Scottish government, for its part, has mapped a lot of their policies against those 4 Ps that I showed to you earlier. And just finally, this is a small regional local government area in the state of Victoria here in Australia called the Mount Alexander Shire Council. Their local economic development strategy is all about building a wellbeing economy. And as the then mayor said, yes, we're adopting the wellbeing economy agenda. It's about focusing on quality of life, environmental sustainability, and social justice. The nature in which nature and innovation flourish. This should be the richness of our lives. And I think that's a great example of how different levels of government here in Australia, at least, and in Scotland, are starting to bring in this idea of a wellbeing economy, how they're starting to make those measures matter, not just measure progress, but go on that next more challenging journey of policy entrepreneurship to make the measures matter in order to design an economy that meets the needs of people and planet. Kelsey, I've spoken much longer than I intended to. My apologies, but I will stop there and hopefully we've got some time for discussion with you and colleagues.
No, that was perfect, Catherine. Thank you very much. So everyone, please feel free to either raise your virtual hands or to write in the chat. I think the first comment was from Francesco saying it was interesting. Also, we've had Mark share the TED Talk to Nicola Sturgeon. Thank you for that.
Mark.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kelsey. There is an awful echo. We couldn't understand basically anything. Is it possible, to check it?
Thanks, Francesco. I think, Catherine just managed. So, unfortunately, I think you have to mute when people ask questions. And I'll take the privilege of starting. Catherine, so I think you know that I'm quite sympathetic to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and I want to push because I feel like you're one of the experts. So one question would be, can we start with the economy when we have, let's say, unreliable governments? And what do we do in that instance? And I have plenty of examples related, especially coming from the US context right now, but to be brief, we'll start there. Thank you.
Great question. Oh, so you're on mute now. Okay. Great question, Kelsey. And I think there's a lot of ways that we could take this, but I'm noticing several other people have raised their hands. So I'll try to give you a bullet point answer. Yeah, I think so many governments at the moment are ignoring so many opinion polls that show people around the world want an economy that is more sustainable, humane. They want action on inequality. They want action on biodiversity loss and environmental breakdown and climate change and so on. So the support is there, and then more importantly, in the deliberative democracy exercises. And yet we don't see governments taking nearly enough the level of action and the type of action that's necessary to shift the way the economy is. And I think that does mean we need to ask questions about the nature of democracy and the currently very thin nature of democracy. I'm a student in my previous life in deliberative democracy, and there's a lot of critiques of how just simply voting every couple of years is a very thin model of engagement. And of course, many of us could have a huge conversation around the influence of the extremely wealthy on our politics. There's this idea of political capture that a lot of political economists will talk about. I'm Australian, and so I'm all too familiar with the influence of a certain media baron who is now peddling his wares in the US, and the influence that has, and so on and so on. And so I think there's a huge disconnect between what people really identify most matters to their lives and the outcomes of our political processes and how they are shaping our economic system. I was asked a couple of months ago on a panel, well, do we have time for democracy? Should we just be a bit more like China? And my answer is, I think we need more democracy. We need to really enable people to feel, and I'm just listening, the helicopter's about to start, so I'll go back on mute in a moment and you can talk while it moves. We need more democracy. We need more citizens' assemblies, more participatory budgeting, more democracy within firms so people feel in control, and that politicians more sensitive and more local decision making too. I mean, I'm very sympathetic and a fan of the idea of subsidiarity that, of course, Europe talks about a lot. You know, have the decision taken as local as possible. But I think there's a whole range of reasons. There will probably be many more seminars, and folks here will have their own views about why governments are not sufficiently accountable to citizens currently, and creating, I mean, there's a huge, to give you an example here, there's a huge push here in Australia to take strong action on coal mines and climate change, and yet the government is still rolling out gas, rolling out more coal mines. I'm going to go back on mute because there's a helicopter leading out just outside. So you talk for a moment, Kelsey. It'll be gone in a few minutes.
Thank you, Catherine. Thankfully, I don't hear the helicopter much, but I do know it's hard to think. Maybe I could say it, so it just, if we have a Wellbeing Economy Alliance that's working well, that will also give people more time to engage in democracy. So it could go together. We do have several questions, so I'll let Mark, you are up next.
Great, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Kelsey and everyone. Great presentation. I wanted to ask sort of a question that relates both to measurement and to participatory stuff. So I'm increasingly of the opinion that starting with the metrics is actually kind of undermining wellbeing public policy efforts, because the key issue is that wellbeing is just like very hard to measure, and it's an emergent property of complex systems. And if we start with these kind of fairly bland metrics that we tend to have in the national frameworks like life expectancy and this sort of thing, then it actually distracts us from understanding that complex causal system. And relatedly, I think the deliberative stuff, as you said just now in your answer to Kelsey, is much more effective when we do it locally, and it points us to local reform priorities, local policy issues. But I worry that if we are starting all our wellbeing economy efforts from national statistics, that it actually sort of cuts off that localism before it can begin, because now everything is framed in terms of the national wellbeing indicators rather than the local wellbeing indicators. So I just wonder, as a question, whether it might be interesting to think about starting with the analysis and the design part of your graphic rather than measuring what matters, because it seems to me like the analysis and design points you to what matters. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I agree. And helicopter's gone now, so hopefully you can't hear it anymore. No, I agree, and I think that's why doing a national conversation or a local conversation, whatever level of government we're paying attention to here, is so critical. Partly also because of the power dynamic. I mean, there's lots of very, very smart people who, if you were to get them in the room and say what matters to people, they've done the analysis, they've read the theory, they could come up with a suite of measures. We really know what is important to people around sense of purpose and dignity and relationships and health. But that is not a transformation of power. That is so important to the wellbeing economy agenda. It's about bringing people to the fore. That's so critical. So also then the strategy of having the consultation, having engagement, so people feel they recognize themselves in what emerges from that, in that vision. So they then hold their governments to account, various layers of government. And I mean, most people, when they're talking about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their car, not their quality of life. And of course, I agree with you about bland measures. You know, who knows what a Gini coefficient is or parts per million, policy geeks like us. But it's not going to enliven people when they're talking about the sort of community that they want their kids and their grandkids to grow up in. So I agree with you. I think it has to start. That's why having that conversation is the very first step one in that first arrow that I showed. But I think also we can't stop with the measures. And I think that's where a lot of OECD governments have stopped. They've got those dashboards. And are they well on their way to becoming wellbeing economies? Absolutely not. They're sitting there as annexes to government budgets or as parallel measurement suites, but they're not shifting the political economy in government. They're not changing the conversation about what the economy is doing, who it's working for, and so on. And so I think that shows too that we need to really bring about a wider shift in mindset around the function of the economy. And that's why I talk about making the measures matter. And I almost think it's almost like the baton needs to be passed from our colleagues in statistics offices who have done a cracking job of bringing together great data sets. Less so here in Australia, but they're catching up. But colleagues across, the UK, the Office of National Statistics has done a really good job over the last 10 years of increasing measurements and so on. And I imagine Luxembourg and colleagues in many countries who are represented here on this call. But the baton almost needs to be passed to policy entrepreneurs to make those measures matter, to do that upstream analysis, and then figure out quite profoundly different ways of working in government, quite profoundly different ways of assessing policies as well. I mean, here in Australia, for example, they're legally bound not to take account of what they call second round effects, essentially sort of, the ripple effects of a policy. So it means they're sort of really very blinkered, both for, on positive and negative impacts of a policy. And so they're the sorts of change of ways of working inside government that I was talking about as well. But Mark, cracking question, and love to chat more. And hey, congratulations on your book, everyone. If you haven't got Mark's book, you should get it.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
So we have about 4 more questions currently, and we might have more coming up. So encourage people to try to be brief, both in your questions. Sama, please feel free.
Hi, I wasn't going to put my camera on, but apparently my sunglasses have been showing the whole time. I'm not wearing them because I'm trying to be cool. It's just I had a close encounter with the sea a week ago, and so I'm having to. So I lost my normal glasses. Anyway, thank you so much, Catherine, for your presentation. It was inspiring and realistic at the same time, which I think is important. Mark, just kind of thinking about what you were saying, I think that the way I would see it is that Catherine, that sort of diagram is a heuristic in the sense that it helps us kind of think about the steps that we need to take. And I think it's intentionally an unthreatening heuristic in a sense that we're kind of saying, hey, governments, you just need to start with thinking about measurement. It's not, then we can go on to the harder steps. I think in reality, we do need to think about all those steps at the same time. And I think that one of the things that was perhaps most helpful for us when I was working at the New Economics Foundation a decade ago was to recognize that we need to actually think about the policies that we want to achieve before we actually think about the indicators. So we actually sort of recognize, no, we do want to think about the sort of those last stages before we just think about indicators. And I think at the end of the day, we need to do those side by side. And the purpose of starting with the vision, or the purpose of sort of starting early with the vision, is it's in a way, and when you do it in the way that Catherine suggested, where it's a very sort of deliberative bottom-up process, engaging citizens, it's in a way actually what's important is you're defining a constitution, right? You're kind of saying these are the things that matter. It's not necessarily the indicators themselves aren't that important. It's the goals, because unless we really say this is what we want to achieve as a society, then we still fall back on, okay, but is it good for growth? And so we need to have really clear, these are what we want to achieve. These are the things which are important, and not specifically growth. That's the kind of, I think, the most important thing. That's why that needs to be a first step. I have one question. I have lots of questions, but we haven't got much time. So I'll just ask one question. Because I just kind of was thinking about these 4 Ps that you presented, and I've seen them before, but I was thinking about this, the purpose, prevention, predistribution, and people powered. I was curious, when you look at the WeAll website, there's this sort of start with these sort of 5 concepts of participation, fairness, dignity, nature, and purpose. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit about the evolution. I mean, is this a sort of an evolution of that? Is this meant to be sort of next to that? I like the 4 Ps more, and I'm just kind of curious, like what led to that change and development.
Okay, and I agree with you on a lot of what you've said there, and the harder steps. But they have to be simultaneously. But I think there is a key sequence of what feeds into one that I was trying to get at. You have to measure in order to be able to understand what the policies need to pay attention to, but the vision prior to that. And I love your parallel with the Constitution. They're not an evolution. The 5 needs and the 4 Ps. So for folks who haven't seen on the Wellbeing Economy Alliance website, they set out what they call the 5 needs, essentially what the economy needs to provide. These needs were developed through crowdsourcing through our members, really drawing on a lot of Indigenous literature as well around the idea of a good life, and rather than just a bigger life. They're things like we need dignity, sense of purpose, fairness, nature, and participation. Then they're sort of almost starting to distill what the goal is. And then the 4 Ps are really just a visualization, to me, comprehension mechanism to get your head around the huge plurality of changes that are going to be needed to build an economy that delivers those 5 needs, or however you want to describe the good life, whether it's thriving within planetary boundaries, or it's flourishing on a sustainable planet, or however you want to describe the ultimate goal. You need the wellbeing economy underneath that, and all those changes needed to create a wellbeing economy, and that's where the 4 Ps come in. So they're two different on 2 different levels, if that makes sense. And the 4 Ps are just really like I said, a comprehension device to get your head around that suite of changes. And I mean, the good news is that people around the world are working on different pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. So it's not a step into the unknown. The challenge is really to help it add up. And also all these great islands of progress, until we change how we think about the economy and think about the economy as in service of what we really need, those amazing instances of progress will just be vulnerable to pushback and being snuffed out, and then the countervailing forces of decisions taking elsewhere. I hope that clears it up, Summer, and apologies for any confusion that I've created by not explaining the relationship well enough.
Thanks, Catherine. So again, we have several questions yet also in the chat. So if you could be both brief in your question and, sorry, Catherine, in your answer as well, we'll try to get to a couple more. Francesco, and that'll go to the chat.
Great. Thanks a lot, Catherine. I'm actually thinking about the obstacles on the way of establishing a well-being economy, and that can be a lot. But one that I find particularly difficult to deal with, and I'd like to hear your opinion on, is the role of lobbies, which, by the way, also play a huge role in undermining the efficacy of democracy. How this also, if you want, intertwines a little bit with your comment on redistribution, getting the market economy to do the heavy lifting, as if we can push the market economy to behave in a virtuous way. So I kind of see a conflict there between the role of lobbyists that push governments towards serving their own interests, and at the same time, you're saying that we can have the market economy to contribute to the greater good. How do you see this working? How can we push lobbyists to become virtuous?
Thanks. And yes, I did a report for the Club of Rome that was published about a year ago, actually, around what has been successful in getting even small sense of progress in this agenda. And I came up with sort of a list of things. And then the key part of the report was, and what's been the pushback and the resistance? And that was a long list. And very much in that was what I called blockers. And I identified 3 levels of blockers. One of which was the lobbies and those, I guess, various folks and organizations and entities that do very well out of the current system. And then there's those who are sort of complacent with business as usual and almost like a sort of dead hand on change. And then there's also those who are doing quite badly in the current system, but are not not mobilized to be part of this movement. And they're reaching for what I describe as coping mechanisms at the metaphorical pillbox and at the ballot box, as we see that in instances around the world. And I don't think there are any easy answers. I think partly the way our current democratic systems are set up are liable for influence by these lobbies. And I mean, I've spent 20 years in the UK. I'm now back in Australia, where the influence of corporate lobbies over government is profound, and all sorts of insidious ways, whether it's through donations to political parties, access to politicians, paying for media campaigns, just even threatening to run a media campaign anti a potentially positive step forward is enough here in Australia to get the government to flinch and back off. So it's profound. And this is the sort of thing that keeps me awake at night, Francesca. I don't know. All I can think about is that it has to be some sort of countervailing force to offset the hysterical pushback that you often get from these lobbies and working on behalf of the vested interests. One good instance of progress in the last few years federally here in Australia, in a government that has been very timid in the face of powerful lobby groups, where they have gone a bit further, has been in the realm of industrial relations reform, essentially actually some good pre-distribution in terms of rights for casualised workers, addressing some of the gig economy conditions. And I think why they've been good at staring down that pushback, because certain employer groups came out with quite hysterical reactions to quite modest proposals on industrial relations reform, and the government did keep going and brought these in. And I think it's because they had a decent, strong union. I mean, unions have been gutted here in Australia, but nonetheless, they were still strong enough. And I'm left questioning, what is the equivalent impact of unions in these sorts of areas? I mean, there clearly in Australia wasn't a strong enough environmental movement to help governments push in closure of coal mines and against gas and so on. So this is the question I wrestle with, and I'm just so open-minded to how we do it. I think it has to be mobilization, but at scale, to translate those supportive opinion polling. And I collect them. I have a lot of opinion polling data that shows people around the world are very up for a lot of these changes, but it's patently not enough. And so we have to translate it to proactive mobilization. So if anyone has ideas of how to do that at scale, do that mobilization at scale, I would love to hear, because I think that is one of the key critical questions of our time. But great question. I'll have to check the chat later to see what all you've been discussing.
Very briefly, thank you for your answer. I will check out your report to the clipboard room. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So if you don't mind staying, maybe we have, I think there are too many questions to address, but maybe we can address just two more. So there was one in the chat rather early on that asks about tools. You said that we need new analytical tools capable of designing new policies. Maybe you can specify more clearly what you mean by that. This was Antje Jansch. New analytical tools capable of designing new policies. What new analytical tools do you have in mind, perhaps beyond national dashboards? And maybe if we can, at the same time, just collect the question from, it was a Stefano, sorry, I lost your hand, Turini, Stefano Turini. You want to go ahead and ask? Please be brief.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm doing my PhD on well-being economy, like how develop a framework for a policymaker in a well-being economy. And at the moment, I saw that like there is not like any city who has like who we can consider it as a post-growth. So the question is, how is possible, and what are the first action that the policymaker at the city level should do in a post-growth, and given it's like acting in an environment which is like economic growth, let's say, driven. So yeah, that's the direct essay point.
Great. So I will rattle through these great questions. In terms of tools, I think there's a suite in terms of how folks are doing root cause analysis. I think a lot of evaluation methodology is really important here, sort of contribution analysis that can take us into a more upstream, more holistic way of thinking about the impact policy makes. I think broadening out beyond fairly narrow cost benefit analysis is another mechanism. The Centre for Policy Development, which is a group I am an advisor to here in Australia, has just published a report called Embedding Wellbeing into Policy, and they have a suite, and they did a ton of interviews there. So it's got a suite of different mechanisms and tools and advice. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance has a document called the Policy Design Guide, and they're also now running a free course for policymakers about implementation of this agenda. It's a great course, so I'd really encourage folks who are curious about that harder task of implementation, the task of policy entrepreneurs, to have a look at the Policy Makers course on the We All website. And your question around post-growth, you're right. I mean, no country is doing this. Different levels of government, I think, are starting to talk about the vision and understand the vision. Very few have really grappled with the huge challenge of stepping back away from many of those growth dependencies, some of which are more in the head than actual. There's just sort of the path dependencies of this is what we've always done, and the way the media and oppositional parties react and hold governments to account for movements in gross domestic product. And then some are a function of the way the current economy and governance systems are designed. For example, the link between, the fact that in a lot of countries, tax revenue is linked to highly dependent on income tax. And then the idea that, well, we need that tax revenue to spend on hospitals and schools and education and so on. There's ways of decoupling that, different tax regimes, but there are lock-ins that I think we can unpack. But to get governments to really embrace that challenge is enormous. Where I think there's a lot of heart is at the local level, and I shared with you the Mount Alexander Shire Council. They've just won an award for that. They have been given a prize and essentially a spotlight by the Economic Development Association of Australia for having their economic development plan as all about the wellbeing economy. So they haven't implemented it yet, Stefano, but they'd be great to look at and perhaps follow their progress. And then I think, at the city level, you will see some tentative pieces, but no one's added this up yet. You also see some great, I think, progress in terms of certain businesses who are not obsessed with growing, who are just wanting to be a successful, commercially viable business, but to do so in a really constructive way that's, yes, commercial viability, but that's not the goal in its own right. And so I think we can learn a lot. And there's a lovely case study, and it's Thursday night here, so I hope you'll forgive me talking about beer, but of a wonderful brewing company just outside Glasgow where I used to live, where the chap who ran that just said, well, I want to get a little bit bigger because then I could have the bottling plant on my site, and that would reduce the environmental impact of sending my beer off-site to be bottled. And then he said, but I don't want to get any bigger than that because I love making beer and I don't want to be in the back office doing the accounts and the spreadsheets and the budgets all the time. So it was growth for a purpose, but not beyond the useful state. And it's a tiny case study at the end of a presentation, but I think there are examples, a lot of examples of business in different ways, maybe not using the terminology of post-growth, but just saying, well, what's the optimal size of my business and what's my business for? Happy to chat more too, Stefano. Great you're doing that PhD.
Katherine, that's a perfect place to finish on a case study about a brewery. And we are a bit over time. I want to respect your time. And so maybe if you just have any last words for us, then we'll close. Thank you everyone for attending and a great chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. I will save the chat and we'll do what we can to continue this offline.
Yes, and that's my favorite word. Let's go through the questions. And if there's, it's been wonderful, some people responding to the request for references, and that's a beautiful example of, a collegial community of practice here. But if there are questions that haven't been responded to, I can share the references and so on. And just for everyone who's playing a different role in this, thank you. There's a beautiful Maori phrase that I've recently come across that says, if everyone plays their part, the job will be done. And so we can't all be the statisticians. We can't all be the heads of state. We can't all be the head, CEOs of a little brewing company that's, post-growth in essence. We can't all be the visionaries or the hospices of what needs to be powered down, but just to embrace this plurality of roles and tasks. And that's what it's going to take. because I don't think there's any more important question at this moment, but how we redesign our economic system so it's much better for people and planet. So thanks for joining today. Really appreciate the opportunity, Kelsey.
Thank you.